Imagine a world teeming with life, a world where faith is absolute, the social order is divinely ordained, and the horizons of life are local and familiar. This was Europe in the mid-14th century. It was a civilization at its peak, interconnected by trade and pilgrimage, confident in its place in the world. But this world was about to be visited by a terror so profound, so all-consuming, that it would not just scar a generation, but shatter the very foundations of society itself. This was the Great Mortality, the pestilence, known to us as the Black Death. Its story is not just one of death on an unimaginable scale. It is the story of how a microscopic organism brought a continent to its knees, and from the ashes of its devastation, forged the beginnings of our modern world. The vast, arid steppes of Central Asia. For centuries, the bacterium Yersinia pestis existed in a quiet equilibrium, living within fleas that fed on local rodent populations, like the giant marmots. For generations, it was a localized threat. But the 13th and 14th centuries had seen the rise of the Mongol Empire, which created a vast free trade zone stretching from China to the Black Sea. This Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, made long-distance travel safer and more common than ever before. Silks, spices, and ideas flowed freely along these routes. But something else traveled with them. By the 1340s, this ancient pestilence had erupted into a full-blown epidemic, tearing through China and Central Asia. In 1346, it arrived with the Mongol army of the Golden Horde at the gates of Kaffa, a thriving trading port on the Crimean Peninsula controlled by merchants from Genoa. As the siege dragged on, the plague began to ravage the attackers. Faced with annihilation, the Mongol Khan, Johnny Beg, made a decision of unprecedented malice. He ordered the swollen, blackened corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers to be loaded onto his catapults. The bodies arced over the city walls, landing with sickening thuds in the streets, poisoning the city's water supply and atmosphere. This was biological warfare in its most primitive and terrifying form. The Genoese traders, seeing the hell that had been unleashed, abandoned the city and fled in their galleys, hoping to outrun the disease. They were wrong. The plague sailed with them, a silent, invisible passenger on a voyage to hell.
In October 1347, the port of Messina in Sicily witnessed the arrival of what seemed like a ghost fleet. 12 Genoese galleys drifted into the harbor. When the townspeople went to investigate, they were met with a scene from a nightmare. The decks were littered with the dead and dying, their bodies covered in dark, oozing boils. The few sailors still alive were delirious with fever, racked with pain, and speaking of a sickness that had devoured their fleet. The horrified authorities ordered the ships away, but it was a futile gesture. The black rat, Rattus rattus, a constant companion on medieval ships, had already made its way ashore. And on those rats were the true carriers, infected fleas. The disease they carried was threefold. The most common was the bubonic plague. A flea bite would introduce the bacteria, which would travel to the nearest lymph node, in the groin, armpit, or neck, causing it to swell into a grotesque, painful boil called a bubo. From there, Fever, chills, and exhaustion would set in, with death following in about 80% of cases. Far deadlier was the pneumonic plague, which occurred if the infection reached the lungs. It could then be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets from a cough. For this form, the mortality rate was nearly 100%. Deadliest of all was the septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It killed so quickly, sometimes in a matter of hours, that its victims often died before any symptoms could even manifest, their skin turning dark purple from internal bleeding, giving the Black Death its name. To a world that believed sickness came from bad smells or an imbalance of bodily humors, this swift, multi-pronged attack was utterly incomprehensible and inescapable.
For 1,000 years, the bedrock of European society was feudalism, an economic and social system built on a pyramid of obligations. At the bottom was a vast population of serfs, peasants who were not slaves, but were legally bound to the land they worked. They owed their lord labor in exchange for a small plot to farm and, theoretically, protection. This system depended on one crucial factor: a large, immobile, and cheap labor force. The Black Death utterly destroyed that foundation. Suddenly, the most precious resource in Europe was not land, but people. With a third of the workforce gone, a massive labor shortage ensued. For the first time in centuries, the surviving peasant had leverage. A lord whose fields lay fallow would offer unheard of incentives to attract workers. Wages for free laborers doubled, even tripled. A serf, once bound to his ancestral village, could now run away, knowing a desperate lord down the road would gladly hire him as a free man, pay him in cash, and ask no questions. This newfound economic power and freedom of movement was a revolutionary shock to the system. The chains of serfdom, which had bound generations, began to rust and break. The peasant was no longer just a beast of burden. He was becoming a bargainer, a wage earner, an individual. The traditional ruling class, the land-owning nobility and the crown, viewed this new reality with horror. This was not just an economic inconvenience. It was a threat to the God-given social order. The idea of a peasant dictating terms to a nobleman was an affront to their entire worldview. In response, they used the power of the state to try and force the genie back into the bottle. In 1351, the English crown enacted the Statute of Laborers, a landmark piece of legislation that made it illegal for employers to pay more than pre-plague wages and illegal for workers to demand them. Similar laws were passed across the continent. This attempt to legislate away the laws of supply and demand created enormous resentment. The newly empowered peasantry, having tasted a better life, would not be forced back into subjugation. The result was an explosion of social unrest. In 1358, the Jacquerie Revolt erupted in France, a brutal uprising of peasants against the nobility. Even more famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Tens of thousands of commoners marched on London, led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, who preached a revolutionary sermon with the famous lines, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Though these revolts were ultimately crushed with great brutality, they sent a clear message. The old world of unquestioning deference was dead and buried. In a world where the Catholic Church was the unquestioned authority on life, death, and salvation, the plague posed an existential theological crisis. If the Church held the keys to the kingdom of heaven, why were its prayers so useless? If its rituals could grant grace, why did the pestilence not spare the pious? The clergy died at alarmingly high rates, often because they were the ones ministering to the sick and dying, performing last rites. This dedication cost them their lives, and in the eyes of the public, the Church its aura of divine protection. Many survivors felt a profound sense of abandonment by God, or believed the plague was a sign of the final apocalypse, a divine punishment for humanity's bottomless sin. This spiritual desperation led to extreme and often heretical movements. The most dramatic were the flagellants, organized brotherhoods of men
who marched from town to town, chanting hymns and publicly whipping themselves until they bled, believing their extreme penance could appease God's wrath. Initially tolerated, their anti-clerical message and claims that they could forgive sins saw them condemned by the Pope. For many others, the crisis led not to public spectacle but to a quiet internal shift. They began to seek a more personal, mystical faith, one that relied on direct communication with God rather than the mediation of a corrupt or powerless church. This profound questioning of institutional religion was a tremor that would, over the next century, lead to the earthquake of the Protestant Reformation. Human nature in the face of incomprehensible terror often seeks a simpler, more tangible enemy. It is easier to fight a neighbor than an invisible pestilence. As the plague raged on, a dark and familiar poison began to seep through European society. Scapegoating. Wild rumors, born of fear and ignorance, spread with the speed of the plague itself. The wells, it was said, had been poisoned, and who was to blame? In the minds of many, the answer was the eternal outsider, the Jewish people. Across the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Spain, a horrific wave of pogroms was unleashed. Jewish communities were accused of a monstrous conspiracy to destroy Christendom. Confessions were extracted under torture, and these confessions were used to justify mass slaughter. In Strasbourg in 1349, before the plague had even reached the city, the town's entire Jewish population of 2,000 people was rounded up and publicly burned alive. In Mainz and Cologne, flourishing Jewish centers were completely annihilated. Despite the fact that popes and enlightened rulers pointed out the obvious, that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, the massacres continued. It was a horrifying eruption of prejudice and violence, a stark reminder of how easily societal collapse can turn into organized hatred. To live through the Black Death was to become intimately familiar with mortality. Death was no longer a distant, predictable event at the end of a long life. It was a constant, arbitrary, and ever-present companion. This collective trauma fundamentally reshaped the European psyche and found its most powerful expression in art. The most striking new theme was the danse macabre, or the dance of death. In countless murals and woodcuts, animated skeletons were depicted leading a procession of the living to their graves. Crucially, the figures came from every station of society: a pope with his tiara, a king with his crown, a knight in his armor, a merchant with his coins, and a poor peasant with his plow. The message of the Danse Macabre was twofold. It was a grim reminder of mortality, the concept of memento mori, remember you must die. But it was also a radical form of social satire. In a rigidly hierarchical world, death was the only true equalizer. The wealth and power that mattered so much in life were rendered utterly meaningless in the face of the grave. This obsession with death, decay, and the vanity of earthly life saturated the culture. Some reacted with hedonism, adopting a eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die attitude. Others turned to extreme piety. But for everyone, the experience of the plague left an indelible scar, a new awareness of the fragility of life and the certainty of its end. While it is hard to speak of a silver lining to such an immense tragedy, it is a historical fact that periods of great disruption often act as powerful catalysts for innovation. The Black Death, by shattering old certainties and creating new problems, forced societies to adapt in ways that would have lasting benefits.
In the realm of public health, the Italian port city of Ragusa pioneered a revolutionary concept. They decreed that all arriving ships and their crews must be isolated for a period of time to prove they were not carrying disease. They initially called it a Trentino, 30 days, which later became a Quarantino, 40 days, the origin of our word quarantine. It was the birth of public health policy. The high death rate among educated elites created a desperate need for literate administrators, lawyers, and priests. This led to the founding of a wave of new universities and colleges across Europe, institutions that were often more secular and practical in their focus than their older theological predecessors. The sheer volume of the Black Death was not merely an event in history. It was an engine of history. It did not create the Renaissance or the Reformation out of thin air, but it acted as a colossal, brutal accelerator, clearing away the dead wood of the medieval world and allowing new growth to emerge. The old feudal order was fatally wounded, giving way to a more dynamic, cash-based economy. The absolute power of the universal church was broken, creating space for individual conscience and the rise of the nation-state. The concentration of inherited wealth in the hands of fewer survivors created a new class of patrons who would fund the explosion of art and learning we call the Renaissance. The world after the plague was irrevocably different. It was a world where labor had dignity, where authority could be questioned, where new ideas had room to breathe, and where the state began to take responsibility for the health of its citizens. The Black Death serves as a terrifying reminder of humanity's vulnerability to disease, but it is also a testament to its resilience. It demonstrates how a society pushed to the absolute brink can not only survive, but can be fundamentally and permanently transformed. The world the plague made was the crucible from which our own modern world would eventually be forged.